Hi, everyone. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Toronto. I apologize about the bad mic and visual. I also apologize about the Wi-Fi connection. Unfortunately, my secretary booked me a room in a hotel with really dreadful Wi-Fi. So I'm on the top floor in a small lounge in a little obscure area, nice view of the city. And I hope that this is a good enough signal. So far, this has been the one that's had the best signal throughout the hotel. Okay. So anyway, I wanted to do an AMA. I've been wanting to do an AMA for a while, but unfortunately, I've been on the road and I've been quite indisposed with recent events. But I did promise to do an AMA in Toronto. And so this is my last night in Toronto. Tomorrow I fly out to California to speak at a conference. And then after that, I get to go back home. So to be an honest man, I guess I have to broadcast tonight. So thanks everybody for joining me, and let's get to it. Okay, an AMA is an Ask Me Anything, and the feed might die. Again, I'm on a hotel Wi-Fi, and I do apologize if that occurs, and I'll try to correct the issue. Okay. So let's start with some of the news items before getting to your questions. And there's actually a thread, and I'll go ahead and post that thread in the comments for people of things that people previously asked starting about a month ago. And these were questions that accumulated, and there's over 200 of them. And then, of course, I'll try to answer some of your questions as well. So we'll go back and forth between the live audience and the questions in the thread. First news items, as many people are aware, there's been some issues with the Cardano Foundation. As I stated previously last week, these issues will not have an impact on Cardano's success or our ability to launch the protocol, get things done, continue our scientific research, or for Emergo to embrace partnerships. What it has done, however, has slowed the community growth, and it made it more difficult for us to combat things like FUD, trolls. It's also made it more difficult for us to build a cohesive community where we're all working on the same page and we're all unified. So what we've done in the last week at IOHK and Emergo is that we've begun executing on a multi-pronged strategy to start the buildup of community management. The first prong of that strategy has been to see what we can salvage from the existing community management structures that we have, working with people who are already in that role but underutilized or in many ways prevented from doing their job. Second, working with the community as a whole, in particular the guardians of Cardano and some of the podcasters like Philip and others. And what we've decided to do is try to build up a small department within IOHK. We're also going to allocate some people who are working on other projects to assist for the moment with community management, just so we can get that set up and where it needs to go. So we'll make an announcement probably in a week or two about the community management team at IOHK, but we've already begun coordinating with the community management team at Emergo. We're working with Sebastian, we're working with Miyataki and others there. And Sebastian actually today just released a wonderful series, I believe 14 lectures on how NePiPaus works. And what we're going to try to do is get much more educational content out. The Rust Cardano team has also released some infographics on Rust Cardano. And if you guys like those and you think they're interesting, what we'll try to do is create those for every aspect of our protocol. So people have these printable, easy to understand sheets that help break down very complicated concepts for the general public. In addition to that, we'd like to set up a podcast where we run it maybe once to twice a week, similar in format to the Let's Talk Ethereum podcast, Let's Talk ETC podcast that Christian Severino runs. But given the scope and scale of Cardano, we'd like that podcast to be run by more than a single host. So our hope is to have 3 hosts, somebody from Emergo, someone from the IOHK side, and hopefully someone from the Guardians side, and for them to have a split format of topics in addition to topics, talking about doing interviews and things like that, either with our scientists and engineers, prominent members of the community, people who've bought a lot of ADA, want to tell everybody why they're so passionate about the project, or people doing interesting things. For example, I've gotten some tweets recently about a gentleman out in Eastern Europe who recently planted a ginkgo tree and sent me some pictures over Twitter, which was really cool. And it'd be nifty to know why he did that and how he heard about the project. We also, about a year ago at the IOHK Summit, invited someone who started accepting ADA at their hotel down in Spain. And it was great to have dinner with them. And so these are cool stories, and it would be fun for these stories to be told in a more public way so people can kind of see that they're not the only people around who know about Cardano. One last thing about the recent events, I've noticed that a lot of people have become somewhat hostile and aggressive towards the foundation as a whole, and in particular towards people like Michael Manelli and Michael Parsons. And the reality is that we have a commercial dispute and we feel they're not doing their job, but it doesn't mean we can't be civil, and it doesn't mean that we can't be respectful. As a community, we've asked for questions to be answered, and as a community, we've asked for leadership change. And the ball is now in the court of the foundation and the members on that side to send a response. If they don't, then over time, we can get more aggressive. But unfortunately, some people have used this as a mandate to aggressively attack and go deeply personal and to engage at a level of civility that, or lack of civility, I should say, that is counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish. So to those who are taking this deeply personally, I do too. I feel the same anger and disappointment that you do. But let's calm down a bit, and let's be reasonable and rational, and let's do what we can do to get us where we need to go as a community as a whole. I'm also quite proud of the Guardians of Cardano's efforts to keep things where they need to be, keep the pressure high, keep asking questions, keep digging into the history, because at the end of the day, this is as much their protocol as it is my protocol, as it is your protocol. And they have every right to demand transparency, honesty, and accountability amongst every actor, myself included, Emergo, and the foundation, and those who represent them. So keep up the good work. And for those who are being a bit hostile and vicious, tone it down. Okay. All right. So let's get to some of the questions. I'll take up something from the set here. All right. Death Metal asks, what are your thoughts on Lightning Liquid Network? Does it lead to centralization? So I get this question a lot, and it's an interesting question of, well, what is centralization? You know, what leads to centralization? So right now, if we look at the structure of Bitcoin, a very strong argument can be made that a very small group of people, less than 10, who own mining interests, mining pools, and mining capacity, are basically in control of more than 51% of the hash power. So from a certain perspective, if that is your only metric of decentralization, it would be perfectly reasonable to say that this is a somewhat centralized system. If only a small group of people, we call it the 2 pizza rule. If you could feed all the people with 2 pizzas, then it's probably not a decentralized system. That said, there are developers, there are exchanges, there are checks and balances, and when the system has been pushed too far in one direction, there's always the opportunity to fork when people have philosophical disagreements. The 2 most prominent examples of that are Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic. So given the threat of forks, in the event that people don't do their job, and given that there is diversity amongst developers and diversity amongst all of the actors, from that perspective, one can make the argument that Bitcoin, for example, is a decentralized protocol. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Where it gets interesting is when you start talking about services that exist in parallel or on top of the Bitcoin network or a blockchain as a whole, things like the Lightning Network or the Raiden Network, or things like sidechains, which are in some way connected or reliant upon the master chain and require some degree of federation to work. So you fall back on the, well, is that decentralized or centralized? And again, you run into the same situation of, well, Who can stop you from using the service? And are those people likely to cooperate for particular reasons, say political or economic reasons? Or can those people be coerced or pressured into working against your best interest as a user of the system? So in the case of what's been proposed for Liquid, or in the case of what's been proposed for Lightning, I personally don't believe that unless there's substantial political pressure, that there's too much of a risk of the operation of such services from being somehow shut off as a consequence of a monopoly or centralization. I think over time, these services will tend to decentralize, and over time, more checks and balances will occur so that it will become more difficult for people to attempt to shut down or co-opt these types of systems. Remember, not too long ago, about 10 years ago, it was very easy to shut down the Bitcoin network. You just simply would shut down Satoshi's single mining node, and the network would die. So networks that people use in our environment tend to become more resilient over time. Now, on the Cardano side, we are quite interested in payment channels and state channels. And we think the way that we've set up delegation and the reality of having stake pools as probably the predominant builders of the chain means that you can also piggyback layer 2 systems and value add services like oracles in that set. So I'm currently in Toronto because Ouroboros Genesis was presented today. And during that same session that we presented the protocol, there was also a session from Stefan Zimboski and his authors on general state channels, and other presentations about using things like payment channels. So there's a lot of innovation in that space, and it would be quite easy for us to put a very reasonably decentralized payment system that permits micro payments and very, very low cost transactions and very high frequency transactions that occur off chain and eventually settle on chain like Lightning does into the Cardano network. So that's something we'll begin exploring post Shelley. And it's actually quite easy for us to roll that in, because what we can do is just basically take best available technology, and it would be something that could be done in a matter of months with the engineers we have and the architecture we have. So very good question. It's a very interesting question. And I'd highly encourage people to actually read some of the papers that have recently come out on payment channels, and papers that have come out on Lightning and the discussions around it, because it's a deeply philosophical discussion, and it's one that's quite interesting. Now, I did see one interesting paper today. It was called Rapid Chain. It's not a payment channel system. It's actually a shardable BFT system, but embedded within the paper was a deep discussion about latency and block size. And if you look at work all the way back to Christian Decker and Roger Wattenhofer from 2013, the crux of the work is that if you were to broadcast a 2 megabyte block across a network of a reasonable diameter, say it has around 4,000 nodes in it, so something like the Bitcoin network at that time, it took quite a bit of time for such a block to propagate in a matter of minutes. So when you have things like that, you kind of have limitations of the network stack related to the block size. So even in a sharding scenario, there is some maximum throughput of your transaction processing capabilities based upon the data you're attempting to reach consensus over. Now, there are ways to mitigate this, and a lot of people have thought very intelligently about it. But at the end of the day, network propagation and block size and these things is a deeply studied and really interesting topic. And it's closely related to the debate about state channels and payment channels and so forth. Okay, so let's keep going. Why did you wait until the Guardians demanded action to take action? That's something we've been seeing floating around for quite some time. We didn't wait. We'd been taking action for months and months, and frankly, about 2 years in the relationship. But we tried to take action with diplomacy and as adults. We had many meetings, some cases more than 14, 15 people in the meetings. We tried every avenue to build effective, positive relationships. We were deferential. We invited the foundation to attend events that we held. We allowed IOHK developers to stop working on the protocol to go to community events that the foundation held. We made recommendations for people we felt would be great scientists and engineers to join. We offered to help the foundation construct a research program when we expressed questions about distributed futures. And it's incredibly important to understand that at the launch of Cardano, when we had many things to do, it would have been incredibly counterproductive for a massive public fight between our community and the foundation as a whole. And at that point, we had yet to exhaust all diplomatic options. We were already planning to make some form of a statement at some point if things could not move along. We were exceedingly frustrated with the lack of financial transparency of the foundation, and we were promised that audited financials would be released so we could understand things like executive remuneration. The Cardano Foundation had a very long window of time, more than a year, to audit their books and produce audited financials. And when it became clear to us that those financials would be unlikely to be released in any reasonable amount of time, that was the last straw for us from a diplomatic viewpoint. So we were at that point considering what options do we have. In parallel, the guardians of Cardano, because they'd heard that IOHK and Emergo were having difficulty with the CF, for example, my personal complaints with the audit and grumblings about the lack of community management, amongst other things, started an investigation where they started looking into affiliations, relationships, corporate registrations for companies that were connected to the foundation, and they produced a very long list of questions. They privately sent that list of questions to the Cardano Foundation. We also received the list a week or so in advance. And at that point, they asked the foundation privately, could you at least give us, the community, the leaders of the community, some degree of transparency? And like with our queries, their queries were met with silence. So the guardians decided to move on, and we realized that at this point, we'd seen a sea change in the community, and it was time for us to move on completely. So we didn't wait. We certainly were working, but we were trying to work in a way that wouldn't introduce a scandal or work in a way that wouldn't introduce bad press for a very young protocol that was trying to form its way. Looking at the Tezos affair, looking at other affairs or scandals in the community, it's incredibly easy for the media, especially our media, to misinterpret very carefully worded, very precise statements and rephrase them in completely inaccurate ways. For example, for over 3 days after we made our announcement, we found out that in Korea, news reports were floating around saying that I left the Cardano movement and IOHK is no longer working on Cardano. We had to issue a statement there saying that that's not true. The same was done in Japan. The same was done in other jurisdictions to prey upon the markets and damage the price of ADA. So we understood that no matter what we said publicly, some group of people, for political purposes, commercial purposes, or just to rob investors of money, would misinterpret purposely the news and broadcast FUD. And that's always the risk you take with disclosures. So it took quite a bit of careful consideration about what was the best way to manage and sculpt the message. And having the guardians around is an incredibly powerful thing for us because it gives us the ability to have community moderators go through and stamp out inaccurate information as they have repeatedly done over the past week. So that's all I have to say about that. Paul Bunyan says, can you talk a little bit more about the topic of interacting with foreign governments? Your engagement, particularly with less developed nations, has been a fascinating aspect of the project. That actually has been probably one of the most rewarding and interesting dimensions of my job. And frankly, it wasn't part of my original contract. The goal of IOHK's relationship with the Cardano ecosystem was strictly to build the technology. So that meant we'd go to scientific conferences, engage universities, hire engineers, work with security auditors. There's a lot of dimensions to that particular job, but it's something that I never imagined would extend and scale to me sitting down with heads of state or foreign ministers or the sons of presidents and having long discussions with them about KYC and AML or the future of securities regulations in their country or issues that they have with the global financial system that are frankly destroying their country's ability to compete or their people's ability to grow within the global community. So that was an unintended consequence of the foundation's inability to lobby or interface with governments in any meaningful way. And it's something that I've come to enjoy more than I think anything else in my job. strictly because I now actually get to see firsthand the people directly who will be impacted by the existence of technology like Cardano. So generally how we talk to governments, especially in developing countries, is that there's usually already liaisons, either community members, IOHK employees, Emergo employees, some group of people who have relationships and contacts. It can be with a member of parliament. It can be with the provincial governor. It can be with a particularly influential captain of industry who happens to know the president's brother or something like that. And when these events occur, it gives us an opening to basically travel to the country, meet with major figures, and ask them, where would you like your country to go over the next 10 or 20 years? And how does blockchain technology fit into that global framework? And have you already done some experiments? So these conversations are not strictly about blockchain. We generally talk about ICT in general. We generally talk about education. We generally talk about their ability to compete globally, particularly in a knowledge economy. So they're, intellectually speaking, very challenging conversations because they cover a very wide range of topics, the type of things you would expect to see at Davos or you would expect to see at a United Nations meeting or something like that. But when it comes to blockchain, usually the discussion stems around trust, credibility, and efficiency. A lot of cases, when you talk about developing countries, you have this bizarre dichotomy where there is enormous value in the country, value in people, value in knowledge, value in labor, value in agriculture, value in natural resources, value in even tourism. But that value is mostly inaccessible to the global markets because the markets, for whatever reason, historical, geopolitical, whatever it might be, cannot effectively connect with and interface with that country. You know, if you come from Angola or Uganda or Ethiopia, there's all these barriers that exist. In some cases, artificial barriers, but they still exist to prevent you from doing things that a person who was born in America, works in America, or the European Union or Japan would be able to do. So when they look at blockchain technology, they view this as potentially a great equalizer. Effectively, what that means is that they can say, hey, look, don't trust us, don't trust whatever laws we have or our brand or reputation. We're going to volunteer to constrain our behavior to a system where even we, the government, won't necessarily be able to manipulate the records or the marketplaces. And given that type of a setting, a lot of people would actually give these countries a second chance for the purposes of direct foreign investment, lending, or massive efficiency gains and things like remittances or so forth. So these are usually the nature of the conversations I have. We've been offered a lot of pilots. We've been offered a lot of opportunities to go and do interesting things. We're particularly interested in building a new compliance system using zero-knowledge cryptography and allowing people to own their own data so banks aren't spying on people and having to issue SARs every time something goes wrong. But that's just one of many projects that we've been approached about or have been internally considering to get involved with. Now, I'm getting older, getting fatter, and I can't travel as much as I used to. This pace is not sustainable. So at some point, we're going to have to diversify the direct foreign outreach. And we've already done so in Africa. John O'Connor, our Director of African Operations, has had meetings with many heads of state, ministers, financial ministers, several princes, kings. It's pretty interesting to see how far he's gone and the countries he's gone to. And we're planning on continuing that amazing pace. And Emergo has done some pretty good work running around Indonesia and other places and Taiwan and so forth. And they've had great meetings and interfaces with governments in Asia. So we're definitely making progress, and we're definitely diversifying the pool, but it is pretty preliminary. And 2019 is really going to be the year where we start seeing a lot of pilots come, and we'll try to pick and choose the ones that can best demonstrate the collection of technologies we've constructed. Hi, Charles. I messaged Jeff Pollock, your CFO, to offer my help in growing Cardano in the UK. Kabir, I'll definitely go ahead and give him a nudge. He's a New Jersey guy, and actually fortuitously is right now in Switzerland and Greece, running around taking care of a few things. Absolutely amazing CFO, the best I've ever worked with in my career. All right, here. Why are you allowing Parsons to get away with stealing over 600 million ADA? Parsons, first off, it's not my call of what Parsons does or doesn't do. The foundation is by design an independent entity, but no, the foundation is a regulated not-for-profit, and that ADA does not belong to Parsons. It is property of the Cardano Foundation. If he attempts to spend it for personal use or gain, he'd likely go to jail for that. So while it's inaccessible and it's incredibly frustrating that things can't be deployed to the market when they were intended to be deployed, not going anywhere. It's just going to sit there until wiser minds prevail, and they eventually always do, as this is a regulated entity, and one way or another it'll open up. And when it does, that money will be spent for the goodwill and interest of the community. And if Parsons has taken some of it, I don't believe he has on the ADA side, then he'll face the consequences of it. So stop fudding. Mike Smith, Charles, I recently heard of a 2-cent ADA charge for transaction truth. If so, will this be lowered? You know, we are planning on actually writing a pretty aggressive paper on a dynamic transaction fee system that's a bit more responsive to the price of ADA. You know, the problem with ADA is ADA, like any cryptocurrency, can't know its own price. So it has to have an oracle, some sort of trusted third party that would inject information into the system to let you know how much it's worth. And Bitcoin suffered from the same issue with transaction fees. When Bitcoin was, 10 cents. So, Bitcoin fees can go up and down. ADA fees can go up and down. It would be nice to have a system that's a bit more dynamic and responsive, but we haven't quite gotten to the point where we're starting to do aggressive research on that. Because right now fees are being burnt, meaning no one profits from them. And when the fees get burnt, it means the monetary supply contracts a little bit. So it's kind of like a tiny little gift to everybody in the entire ecosystem when you spend ADA. We didn't really think too much about dynamically raising the fee or lowering the fee. But it's going to be something that we start looking into quite aggressively in Q1 of 2019. And we'll probably have something that we roll out shortly after the network decentralizes. The simplest way of doing it would just allow people to vote on the fees to lower the default fee in the system, or to give people total control over setting their fees, and then the stake pools can individually decide on which ones they accept. At the moment, the way the protocol is structured, it's easy for a stake pool to accept or reject any transaction they want. They can modify the software accordingly for that. So it's a topic we'll come back to, but it's a topic we haven't thought too much about right now, because we're just quite interested in making sure that we get Shelley out the door. But there is going to be a group of people who worry about specific type of thing. It's kind of the same group of people who worry about all mechanism design and market style things. So the people who write our incentives research, like Elias at Oxford, and we'll write some nice paper on it. And it'll be a good compromise paper, and I think it'll be reasonable. And then what we can do is probably introduce some notion of democracy to try to modify that a bit. But I'd like to see a market-oriented system for it. Another EOS question. Thoughts on Hyperledger? Are you planning on collaborating with them to create industry standards? Hyperledger, David, is a real great collection of projects. There are two major projects within it. One is Sawtooth and the other one is Fabric. We know the Fabric people much better than the Sawtooth people. They're led by Christian Cashin. He's also the head of the IACR, and he's a good guy to have dinner with. And he's one of the world's top experts in distributed systems. In fact, if you ever take a course on the topic, you're probably either going to read his book or Nancy Lynch's book. Nancy's at MIT. Fabric is well constructed. It's written in Go and uses BFT simple, Kafka, uses this concept known as chain code. Basically, you define your actors and write what your transaction semantics are for them, and then they can operate within that environment. So it's a very well thought out, very cogent platform for permission ledgers. The Hyperledger guys are quite interested in working with us in some capacity. We float around a couple of ideas. We have an enterprise version of Ouroboros called Ouroboros BFT. We also have a version of Ouroboros with probabilistic finality that we could deploy for a permission ledger setting. And it would be nice to see if we could roll that their way. So we've batted ideas back and forth about contributions to the Fabric code base. We also have our own enterprise group. It's led by Bruno Paleo, and Bruno is working on a collection of proof of concepts in Scala, which will be used to deploy Cardano-related pilots in Africa in 2019. So relationship is good and warm. We also do joint research with IBM Research. We have a European Union grant, and our side of it is to worry about decentralized software updates. So it's quite complementary to things we worry about with Cardano as a whole. And I imagine that those collaborations could eventually work their way into something like the enterprise blockchain space. So the answer in short is yes. All right, let's see if there's. All right, so let's go to the AMA thread. There were over 200 questions that were asked in the AMA thread, so I'll grab one there. Usually people do this with a second person, but unfortunately I don't have one here with me at the moment. Hi, Charles. I remember Duncan talking about having assets in Cardano as first-class citizens the same way ADA is, without the need for smart contract ERC20 style. Do these assets live in SL? Also, do they have any relationship with ADA? For example, they are under ADA staking rules, or are they independent? Thanks. Okay, so the first part of the question, do these assets live in the SL? The answer is yes. They will live in the SL via the chimeric assets standard. Sebastian created a great video on what that is and how we think about these types of things. And we are going to have our own variant of ERC20 for SL for a person to launch a token on our system. And yes, it is our intention to have our tokens that are issued on the system be first-class citizens. And what that means is that you pay transaction fees for those tokens with the tokens themselves, not with ADA. So the advantage to a person issuing an asset on our system is that they inherit the security that ADA brings them and the Ouroboros system brings them, but they don't have to go and find their own stake pools and miners or deploy and run their own network infrastructure. They're basically living the best of both worlds. They enjoy being a decentralized asset on a decentralized system, but at the same time, they don't have to pay the cost of maintaining that system. So there's a natural question to ask, what is the benefit to ADA for having these types of assets? Well, it is our intention at some point in the future to have some form of a decentralized exchange, and it would make a lot of sense for ADA to be the pairing currency for that. And if that's the case, then it would be basically create a lot of volume to ADA for people going in and out of it, using it as a reserve currency for the trading pairs within the system, similar to the US dollar in the Forex markets. So that alone we feel is a great value relative to whatever bloat this occurs. But we think we'll have enough TPS and storage network capacity to support many, many, many assets in the system. And a lot of the technology we're working on will allow us to eventually have tens or hundreds of thousands of assets over a long arc of time. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Hi, Charles. What happens to the ADA the foundation has? It's going to stay at the foundation until it's useful. If the foundation doesn't give up power, what will happen to Cardano? Nothing. It's just kind of like the Bitcoin foundation to Bitcoin. Cardano is already decentralized enough to not really need the foundation. So as a consequence, if they never become productive, it was kind of a tragic loss to the ecosystem that we weren't able to efficiently use the money. And but it doesn't kill us, and I feel that we'll overcome this event. So if they're useful, they're a value add. If they fail, it will be okay. We'll succeed. So this is a good question. When you talk about putting property deeds on the blockchain, how can you confirm that no one is counterfeiting the deed? Wouldn't anyone with the access to the blockchain be able to put the same property deed twice, or at least have the acreage from two separate properties listed on the blockchain? And how would a property deed from the blockchain be legally binding? This is actually a very smart question, and this is one where it exposes the limitations of what blockchain can do for things like property registration. Blockchain technology is not intended to completely displace people. So what happens is, when you're talking about concepts like who owns the car, or who owns the land, or who owns that bar of gold, these are physical assets. And the story behind those physical assets has to be stored somewhere. So generally you take that story and you write it down on a piece of paper and you store it somewhere, and whoever has access to that and legitimizes that is the person who's got the most power in the relationship. So what blockchain does is says, oh, okay, what you can do is take that story about who owns the land, who used to own it, who will own it, and the transaction mechanics behind transferring it from one person to the other and storing the metadata about it, and put it into a location that's transnational. Now, this is incredibly advantageous because there's a huge temptation, especially in developing countries, for people to change the ledger when politics are convenient. And these can be things like civil asset forfeiture. These can be things like eminent domain. These can be things like outright nepotistic theft, as what we saw during the Mugabe regime in Zimbabwe, or when Venezuela nationalized much of their land. And in these cases, well, the government has taken it. The record still remains the same of who used to own it. Now, why this is advantageous to people is because basically what happens is, when these corrupt, terrible regimes fall apart, it's much easier for us to be able to intervene as a global community, or whoever takes over the country next, and right wrongs in the past. One of the greatest tragedies of the Holocaust, post-Holocaust, was that it was extremely difficult for the survivors to be able to actually return to the land, property, assets that they had taken from them by the Nazis. And this was because a lot of the records of who owned what were destroyed. The same was the case in Rwanda and many other places where there's a diaspora as a result of a genocide or terrible event. And it's already a major issue in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And there are huge debates and disputes. Having a blockchain as the trusted source that has auditable, time-stamped, immutable records is something that would dramatically alleviate these types of issues. The other thing is that it's not a single-purpose system. That's the other power of putting things like land registration, for example, on a blockchain. You're also talking about a payment system, and you're also talking about a signature system, so you can have non-reputable authorization of events. For example, if you're a rancher, all the time you're going to have people come in and ask you things like, hey, can I use part of your land for my cattle come the summer? Or, hey, can I get access to my barn by going through your land? Or, hey, can I take some of your irrigation water? And orally, they'll agree and say, sure. Well, now we have a system where such a discussion can be stored with the land. These off-title discussions can become actually quite problematic when people buy land or have these discussions. It's quite expensive to actually even find out how to go about discovering these agreements, especially when people die or family members fight. So having the ability to tell the story about the property, the agreements that are off title on the property, are incredibly important. As for payment systems, imagine if you have minerals like oil or copper or something on your land. It would be really awesome if you just had a payment system connected to the title, and when you authorize people to come in, they can just directly pay the land itself, and as the owner of it, you get dividends, or you can pull it out or do certain things with it. You can also have property taxes directly deducted from the accounts owned by the property, so people can fund that up. And then governments can have a much more dynamic property taxation system. These are all advantages you get when you actually have a digital land registration system. Whereas if you have a paper system, you have hundreds of independent business activities connected to the land, which unfortunately are all siloed from each other, unaware of each other, and an enormous amount of money has to be spent retaining professionals and working with domain experts to try to sort out all these things. So it's our hope that when we move into these 21st century systems, we'll be able to move some of the poorest countries in the world to have now some of the most sophisticated land registration systems. So where does Cardano fit into all of this? Well, the DNA of Cardano, the protocols we've come up with, like how to handle transactions or how to design a ledger, that can form the backbone of a property registration system. And you can use, at the very least, a public blockchain to act as an anchor for the records there. So you can take hashes of all those records and embed them, kind of like what Factom has done for Bitcoin, and embed them into the Cardano blockchain. So it acts as an auditor of the auditor. So even if the government gets dishonest, you know they are dishonest, and people can show the correct records. Second, by wiring people into a blockchain system, whether it be permissioned or permissionless, you have now created a PKI, and you've created a namespace. And what that means is you now have an interface where you can send assets to those people by a sidechains transaction and back. Given that these private systems can be deployed and they're understandable to the Cardano blockchain, it's entirely possible in 3 to 5 years for people to talk about collateralized lending, where a person can put up their land as collateral for a loan, and you'd actually be able to see and verify and understand that in a decentralized way and have a peer-to-peer lending system to give $50 to $100 to, let's say, a coffee farmer in Ethiopia. And you can even have third-party attestation or insuring of these loans, where if they default, maybe the neighbor will step in and provide some sort of collateral or leverage. Or maybe a government will insure the loans or something like that, or a private entity or an international aid group or something like that. Now, all of these things are really expensive to deploy, and they're highly personal when you're talking about undigitized, unbanked people. When you deploy these types of systems, usually as private ledgers, now you actually have them in an infrastructure that is interoperable with the Cardano system. And then the Cardano system can be the interface to a parallel and new financial system, a place where they can get insurance or loans from that they probably can't get from conventional markets, or issue assets to that they probably couldn't get from conventional markets. In the distant future, maybe 5 or 10 years, we could even talk about security tokens, where co-ops of farms get together and they tokenize their output and actually issue assets, put those assets through a series of complex financial transactions on the Cardano system as native assets, and then people trade them with domain-specific contracts executed via Marlowe, for example. And all of these things can be templated, wouldn't necessarily even require a lawyer, and would in the 20th century look like an IPO or some sort of sophisticated securities offering, require millions of dollars to do, but would be accessible to a group of people that collectively maybe have less than $10,000 or $100,000, and allow them to raise capital or allow them to hedge risk or spread risk around and play and compete in global markets for the first time ever. So that interplay between the public and private blockchain has always been what Cardano is about, and it's something that, whether you're registering land or people, it's something that we look really forward to exploring 2019, 2020, and beyond. All right, let's take another one from the audience. Charles, is Cardano coming out with an ADA debit card or credit card of some type? It was on the roadmap, and it was one of the foundation's responsibilities. They're the ones who announced it. We said, great, let us know if we can help. And nothing happened for a year. Welcome to my life. So Emergo and IOHK are starting to look into it. We've already started talking to some vendors. There's a few that are interesting, and it's not a super hard thing to get done. And now that we're looking into it, hopefully we'll be able to make an announcement soon. Charles, talk to me about ways to make offline transactions besides crypto hardware. It's easy to do an offline transaction. That's always easy to do. I can take a transaction, even with Bitcoin, sign it, put it on a flash drive, hand it to you. Say, here you go. It's yours, Bob. It's all yours. But here's the issue. How do you know that I haven't double spent it? How do you know I actually have it without some other knowledge, like trusting me or having a full copy of the blockchain and being online and checking? That's always difficult. And so trusted hardware is really nice because what it does is it says, hey, you can't lie in both directions. One, when the trusted hardware is able to get access to the chain and verify that it is looking at the right chain, the trusted hardware is able to get a snapshot of history and get a special transaction sent to it to a private key that everybody knows can only live within the enclave. So that's one dimension of it. And then the other dimension is when Bob goes to Alice and says, I'll send you this ADA, what it allows you to do is erase the key on Bob's module and give Alice two proofs. One is the proof that the key has been erased. Two, a proof that that key was unique. There is no other copy of it anywhere else. So effectively what you've done is you've given Alice the value and you've done it in a near infinitely scalable way. Because what's happened is that from the blockchain's perspective, no transactions actually occurred. You've just moved access to some funds from one person to the next person. And you say, but Charles, how do you handle a transaction like that? I mean, what if you have to, what if you have to buy something that's less than the amount you have? Well, we have what's called cash register accounting. We've been doing that for a long time with cash. If you go to the supermarket and say that'll be $1.55, and a person hands you $2, the merchant has to hand back 45 cents. So you can do the exact same thing with this type of a system. You'd have to work a little bit about how to make these types of things efficient. And then actually, this is exactly where payment channels could provide a tremendously good solution. I'm not aware of any software solution or protocol level solution that would give you that same level of assurance that keys have been erased, keys are unique, or that same level of assurance that the transaction that you're trying to clear is actually not double spent or still valid. So I'm sure that wiser people who study this for a living can come and show me something interesting, but I haven't seen any papers, and it looks like trusted hardware is perfect. The other reason why trusted hardware is so appealing is that trusted hardware exists in both your laptop and your cell phone. So as a consequence, if you look to 2020, 2025, that time range, it is incredibly reasonable to assume that the vast majority of people, even the people who live in the poorest countries in the world, will have a device with a trusted hardware enclave in it, meaning these offline transaction capabilities will already be built in by the software, by the hardware vendor into their device. It's an open question whether you can access that and everybody's going to be able to use it, but a very meaningfully large group of people will be able to, and you can even create open source trusted hardware modules and create a kind of a distributed root of trust for authenticating them if you wanted to break the monopoly of what's in SGX or Trust Zone or what AMD has. And it's probably a great line for entrepreneurs to think about and build. But it's a great space. It's a value add to the system. And if we're really serious about getting penetration into marketplaces that don't have reliable internet, it's a must, which is why we put so much money into our Trusted Hardware Lab to study topics just like this. Okay. Yeah, so this is an interesting question. Charles, will Cardano allow for other currencies to be built on top that allows for economic abstractions to facilitate consensus? Like, can I make a currency with a separate token for staking? And the answer is yes, with a caveat of but. So yes, in that you can create your own currency with your own consensus mechanism and your own security notions. And if you're going to go down that road, this is exactly why we embrace the two-layer consensus model, the two-layer blockchain model that Cardano has. We have this idea of SL and CL. So SL is a settlement layer, and that's where all the assets live, financial transactions occur, and domain-specific languages exist for that. And it's been highly optimized for a particular way of handling accounting, which is really beneficial for the vast majority of things we've seen over the last 10 years in the cryptocurrency space. But what happens if you wake up and you say, gosh, I just want to do it myself. I want to have proof of work, but I still want to in some way connect to or be interoperable with Cardano. So that's the whole point of having an overlay layer. Like, for example, when you want to mix accounting and computation together, as Ethereum has done, or as EOS has done, or these other guys have done, you can do that with a control layer. And that's what the second layer of our system is, and what we've already demonstrated in practice with KEVM and the Yella testnets. So when our sidechains protocol comes out, if your system is compliant with that protocol, people will be able to move ADA back into your system and out of your system, and you'll be able to move your token in your system to our system and back. So that's there's not a master-slave relationship, it's a firewalled relationship, meaning that it's easy to move assets to and fro. Now, the first generation of the sidechains we launch will be custom tailored for KEVM and Yella, as this is for interoperability with those smart contract paradigms. But later versions will include more generalities, so we can wire our system together with things like ETC and Ethereum and future versions of other protocols, and potentially even Bitcoin, depending upon where their upgrade path sits, and your cryptocurrency as well. Just follow an open standard. And I think many people will start thinking more about the internet of blockchains and less about their particular blockchain, because it's important to be able to move assets around. So will Cardano make the staking process understandable to normal people? There's a lot of misconceptions about staking, about what it is. I hear things like, what is my percentage return, as if it's like a dividend on a bond or something. It's not. So in the beginning, there was mining. And what was mining? You started with a common reference string. So you started with this notion of the beginning, and then you said, okay, let's have a puzzle contest, and whoever finds the puzzle has the right to move to the next state of the system and decide what that next state looks like, bounded by a collection of common rules. Okay, that's all it is it's a contest, and Bob does his work and Alice does her work, and eventually somebody figures it out and says, I've won, and says, what did I win? I won the right to advance the network, and if I do so, I get paid to do that. So it's a contest. You win the contest, you get the right to do something, and only if you do that thing, you make that block, do you actually get paid. That's the important point of mining. Now, our proof of stake system is no different in that respect. There is a contest, and the contest collects a group of winners. Now, instead of saying that to win that contest, you have to burn more electricity than the entire country of Ecuador or the entire country of Ireland, we can do away with all that nonsense, and we can just elect people proportionally to their stake. It still means that when you win, you have to do something, or you have to give that right to do something to somebody else. And only if you do it, or somebody else does it, will you get paid. So that's not how dividends work. That's not how interest works. Those are, you do nothing, and because your capital's at risk, you get paid a profit for that. This is just saying we have to pick a leader, and the people we pick probably should be the people who have the highest vesting in the best interest of the long-term success of the system. This is not the case with mining, especially when you have competitive proof-of-work protocols. Now, later on, we could change parameters and say, we've come up with some metric, call it gamma. And gamma is designed in such a way where we say you're a good citizen of Cardano. And gamma will bias your chance of winning positively or negatively based upon whether you're a good citizen or not. We could certainly explore that in next generations of proof of stake. Already some on the engineering side have thought about such notions. And so you can move from just how much stake do you have for your chance of winning. But winning means nothing if you do nothing. So you still have to do something. Now, what do you do? At the moment, you make a block. And what does making a block mean? You soak up all those transactions in the mempool, you put them in a certain way, make sure they're right. If there's programs, you run those programs, verify them, and then you put them all in, and then you attach that block to the prior block, and you're done. Then and only then do you get paid. And in our case, you actually have to wait for the epoch to end. Now, later versions of the protocol may include a large collection of other services that if you don't do those things, you get paid less, or in some cases get paid nothing. Or you might even, you're elected multiple times, but contingencies where you have to show up and work all the time or you forfeit all your winnings. That's simple. So that's an important distinction, and it's something that for some reason, somewhere along the way, people have just been unable to understand. There is no difference in the proof-of-stake system from the proof-of-work system in terms of returns. It's a parameter that you set in the system, but the concept is still the same. You're paid to do something. You're not paid for just sitting on your ass and having money. Now, in terms of what percentage should you be paid, that's a parameter of the system, and you have to be pretty careful with that. We published a paper recently with Lias Kasoupas, Lars Brunjis, and Agalos, and that paper covers economic incentives, and that paper is specifically attuned to how should you structure incentives in a way to create a collection of stake pools at a stable state. And we discovered within that paper that we think our system could sustain a total of over 1,000 stake pools, assuming that most people would be rational just to simply delegate. But some people would perhaps want to just run their own pool or run their own staking operation. So I'd encourage people to read that paper. The final parameterization we set as we get a little bit closer to the launch of Shelley, but it's probably going to be around 5% inflation per annum. But there are a lot of factors that fit into that. The amount of transactions we have fit into profit. There's also the concept of the treasury system, and when the treasury system comes out, percentage of rewards will be allocated to the treasury. And these things are discussed in the paper and have been discussed in literature that we have. In particular, works Lars Brunjis has been working on. It's kind of a great question when you see things like this. From Dan Witherspoon, is there any reason Cardano is more suited to the K framework than other protocols? It's kind of like asking, is there any reason my skis are more suited to the desert than your skis? So the K framework is not meant for cryptocurrencies. It's meant for programming languages. And in programs, the goal of the K framework is to say that you have with a programming language semantics and syntax. Syntax are the letters, and semantics are how you string these types of things together to derive meaning. So you have symbols. The alphabet is composed of symbols, and there's operators like plus signs and equal signs, and these things have meaning behind them. So when you say something like the dog leapt over the fence, that's a well-formed, meaningful sentence in English. If you say fence dog leapt, it loses meaning. If you say dog leapt, dog fence leapt, it's these types of things have a requirement, a semantical requirement for how they should be structured, and you can actually have a lot of fun with it. There's a famous sentence, if I get it right: buffalo, 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 buffalo. So 8 buffaloes in a row. You think that that would just be meaningless, but it turns out that the semantical rules of English are structured in such a way that that sentence actually means something. And if you don't believe me, if you enter it all into Google, the very first result will be a Wikipedia page which has a tree showing how to break down that particular sentence and derive a particular meaning of that sentence. So semantical rules can be quite involved, and if you're not familiar with them, it can be difficult at times to understand statements. Now, where things can go wrong are when you're talking about formal languages, and formal languages you would hope would be very rigorously defined and have no ambiguity. Unfortunately, there are times, however, where in the design of a programming language, there can exist ambiguity, And different people have different opinions. Like C compilers, for example, where the same program compiled by different compilers would have different outputs. This is a big issue, especially if you're talking about deterministic financial software, where if things go screwy, everything goes to hell and everybody loses their money. So to ameliorate that, it's very good to remove ambiguity, absolutely. So how you do that is you write a complete, comprehensive, formal set of semantics for your language. And that means whatever statement you see, you're able to derive from that set of formal semantics an absolute understanding of whether that is a well-formed formula, a well-formed statement, or if the statement is not well-formed and as a consequence is meaningless and doesn't have an interpretation in your system. The situation like, snake, tree, wheelbarrow, jump. Like it's words, but they're meaningless in that configuration. Anyway, the K framework is a framework that lets you take a programming language like Java or Python or JavaScript and write the semantics of that in a way so that you can remove that ambiguity, and you can also gain access to a lot of tooling so you can analyze programs that are written in that language in a more generic and abstract way. Now, for non-PL people, this doesn't seem to be very important, and to be frank, it's not for many of the cases. The magic of K is interoperability. Once you have two languages written in the K semantics written for those languages, you can talk about a technique called semantics-based compilation, where you're able, through the magic of PL theory, to move from one language's semantics to a program in the other language. And as a consequence, you'll be able to run that program in that other language. Kind of the way. So this is a kind of a butchered simplification of the concept, but it is meaningful for us as an ecosystem, because what it effectively means that if we do things in a very careful way with Yella, given that we have the K semantics of Yella, all we will need to do when semantics-based compilation has reached its nadir is to just simply write the semantics once of a new programming language. And if we ever want to update Yella, we just update the semantics of Yella, but we do not need to update the semantics of any other programming language, hypothetically. So that means over time, our system could eventually support hundreds or even thousands of programming languages for people to write smart contracts in, and we have almost no upgrade friction when we have new innovations that we want to take to the base layer of the system. There are other advantages with K, like formal verification of contracts, treating them as proof objects, or verified computation, where you can potentially run things off-chain, or writing formal specifications for templated smart contract standards, like what runtime verification is done with ERC 771 and ERC 20, and will do for other tokens as well, other templates as well. But that's the point of K. It's not an end-all be-all technology, and it's not something we've bet the entire farm on, as we have a whole team doing something very different with Plutus, but it is something we feel gives us a really compelling story about interoperability and can bring a lot of mainstream, regular, everyday developers into our system, having this almost universal language. So Micro Shen is talking about a dApp store for Cardano. This is something near and dear to my heart. Recently, Naomi Brackwell released a video of me when I was the CEO of the Ethereum project, very early days, April of 2014. And part of the pre-interview, I was actually discussing this idea of a universal app store for dApps. I don't know if it had made it into the interview or not. I can't recall, but it was something I did discuss a lot back in those days. And it's something I never forgot about. So we have something called Daedalus. Daedalus is actually going to be, at some point, our version of a decentralized dApp store. I've every month get a prototype. We've had some great success actually connecting Docker images to it. And at some point, we're actually going to use the blockchain as a backbone to distribute PKI for authors, metadata, and distribution information, and get to one-click install for people to install the front end and server logic for dApps for either self-hosting or for connecting to a third party, and then have that smart contract uplink, and for dApps then to interface, for example, with your local money, because these things have to be wired together. So we'll let Darko, who's the product manager behind that, make statements later, and we'll certainly have him work with Haley, but that's something every month we see some progress being made, and it's pretty cool progress. Doing interesting things with GraphQL and Docker, and we already have kind of a nice GUI planned out for how the dApp store is going to look and so forth. But it's another value add to people who build dApps in our ecosystem. All right, let's take another question from the Reddit. Now, this is a really interesting question. Do you think having EOS raise 4 billion USD versus you raising somewhere at 60 million USD is anyhow giving them a competitive advantage that will be hard to deal with? It's clear that you have a much better team product performance, but they have an endless source of money. Can this be any sort of threat? That's a good question. I get that question a lot, especially on the road. You know, it's kind of funny that the #2 cryptocurrency raised 18 million to get where it's at, and the #1 cryptocurrency raised nothing. You know, so if you think about that, you know, there's strong evidence in this space that the amount of money you raise doesn't really have a lot to do with your ability to succeed. You know, just recently I read a CoinDesk article on Monero, and they successfully integrated bulletproofs. And bulletproofs, great invention from people in the Valley and California. And the implementation that the Monero people did is interesting. Kudelski audited it, and looks like it'll be successfully in. And it's going to be a huge benefit to their ecosystem. So you don't necessarily need a massive war chest of money to succeed in this space. And then actually there's a great business analogy, and it was the war between Microsoft and Google. So Google had the market share, Microsoft had the war chest. Microsoft wanted to compete with Google, and every year it would launch a new product or a new initiative or try to do something crazy like buy Yahoo, and they would dump billions and billions and billions of dollars into building up Bing and building up their search infrastructure. And they even resorted to trying to pay people, bribe people to use Bing one way or another. Say, hey, we'll buy an Xbox if you get enough Bing points. So despite the fact that Microsoft dumped tens of billions of dollars in strategic acquisitions, briberies, and other efforts, they weren't meaningfully able to move the market share. Simply because, well, Google was more convenient and consumer behavior was more aligned with what Google was about. And Google was also quite competitive as a company and kept adding new features and functionality. And the searches always seem to be, still do seem to be, a little bit better from Google. So I don't think too much or worry too much about competitors like EOS or Tezos who have raised a significantly larger amount of money, because the best that they can do is to go to somebody and bribe them to build on their system. And those bribes are always short-term boosts. Just because you can get Alice or Bob to mitigate to your system, Alice and Bob won't stay there if your system doesn't offer a compelling, great experience for your customer. Second, we tend to compete in different circles. Most people chase the Western developed world. I tend to chase the developing world and have a Pan-African strategy, and Emergo has an Asian strategy. And the types of customers we're dealing with, in many cases, this is the first cryptocurrency that they've ever dealt with. So we are their Bitcoin. So I don't worry too much about it. Third, taking in that much money creates existential risk to the project, because the project becomes less about what can we do for people and what is the mission, the philosophy, the goal, and it becomes more about how do I get some chunk of this large pile of money that's sitting in the backdrop. Billions of dollars are very corrosive, and they're a big temptation, and they're something that eat away at people over time. So it's a liability from that perspective. And also, in my view, the way that they raise their money may encumber considerable regulatory risks moving into 2019 and 2020. So I don't envy their position, and I feel very bad for the people who have chosen to base their entire business's success on those platforms just because they may have gotten a bribe. So we wish them well, but we're not optimistic for success. Now, this is actually a great question. Would it be possible to regular monthly analytics and report statistics regarding the health, activity, and performance of the Cardano blockchain? I did some statistics and analytics. We do have some things built into Daedalus that give us a notion of user experience, as most people who deploy software do. So I've been talking to Neil and Peter, our guys at Predictable Network Solutions, and I've also talked to Robin a little bit, our new open source community manager who's coming on board, about maybe releasing some form of a monthly community report, including key metrics about the growth and health of the Cardano network. One thing that the community as a whole could do to help us along that line is if you could actually identify a collection of key metrics, so KPIs, that you care about, things that you think would be great indicators of the health of Cardano's growth, we could then come up with a plan to track those things on our end and to our best of our ability, and release that with some degree of regularity to the community. Thoughts on Definity? I like Dominic. I think he's a good guy. I like their company. I like that they're putting money into research. I was here at CCS. We presented a paper. The very next paper had Definity co-authors on it. Any venture, whether we compete with them or not, that invests money into science and research and goes through the peer review process and respects that process, I think is a wise venture. And because they're respecting that process, because they're investing in research, I think they're great guys. We'll, of course, always disagree here and there on particular protocols or how to solve a particular problem, but I won't question their ethics and I won't question their business strategy if they're embracing peer review to verify the scientific claims that they're making. So good to see that they're hiring people in that domain, and I hope more people do that. All right, let's take another one from the thread here. All right, we have another question here. You said you don't believe there is a need for complex event processing technology in the Cardano ecosystem. Do you believe Oracle should be trusted to do the complex observations for Marlowe contracts? Under complex, I mean having a complex pattern of high-frequency observables, which is very common in financial domain where Marlowe and smart contracts are positioned. There was a proposal to develop a smart rules layer on top of smart contracts layer, which would have a centralized infrastructure of CEP engines consenting about complex observations they would independently detect. Is this fully out of scope and consideration? Or you expect complex observations to happen in a smart contract layer? This is kind of a really interesting technical question, this whole notion of complex event processing. So basically, succinctly, complex events are things where you can, because you're a human being, you're good at pattern recognition, you can look at a collection of unrelated things that seem unrelated, but then realize that they actually have some sort of relationship to each other. For example, if you see smoke coming out of a window, you walk over and touch the door handle, it's really hot, and you smell smoke, you smell something, you probably would infer, these are independent events, a hot handle and smoke coming out of the window, and my sense of smell means that there's probably a fire on the other side of that door or nearby that door that's causing the door to heat up. Now, you could be wrong, because this is a probabilistic thing. Maybe these are all completely unrelated. Bob is smoking in the bathroom, and that's why the thing is coming out, and somebody's been heating the doorknob with a wire or something. But you look at probabilities. We tend to do this in the financial world, where people write very sophisticated software to look at events and try to group them in a way, and then create a way of processing those events to make decisions about where to go and what to do with those events. For example, there's a very famous event where somebody hacked into a Twitter feed of a news agency, a major news agency, and created a fake tweet saying that the White House was attacked and the president was injured and on the way to the hospital. Now, regardless if you're Republican or Democrat, I believe this happened during the Obama administration, the president being injured in an attack on the White House is considered to be a very bad event for the markets. It creates uncertainty and volatility. Now, if human beings were looking at that, you would expect reaction time a matter of minutes to hours, and for the markets to respond accordingly. So there would be a latency between when the event occurred, and that's a singular event, and when the reaction to the event occurred. What's really curious about it was that the markets tanked almost instantly after that tweet was launched. Because what happened was that we had complicated algorithmic trading systems that were using natural language processing to go through Twitter feeds of millions of news agencies and individuals and stream all of these things together into a market sentiment notion and say, oh, if this collection of events occurs, there's a belief that these events by aggregate mean there's a bad thing, or it's a trading signal to sell or trading signal to buy. So there's all kinds of things like Apache Flink and other things that allow you to think about complex event processing, layer it with ML and layer it with other things, and its financial systems and how people tend to respond. Another common example could be things like fraud detection with credit card systems, where you have Bob living in, let's say, the city of Toronto, and then suddenly in Vietnam there's a transaction. Now, yes, it could be entirely possible that Bob is in Ho Chi Minh buying some noodles with his credit card, but if Bob also on the same day, just 4 hours earlier, purchased dinner in Toronto, it's probably pretty unlikely that he also somehow is in Vietnam when it's physically impossible to travel that far in that amount of time for a reasonable person. So you'd say, no, these events have an issue. This has got to be fraud. But you have to build smart systems, and it'd be a tremendous hassle if Bob does travel a lot, as I travel a lot. Every single time you try to use your card, it gets declined because the algorithms are quite primitive. Well, they could look at things like he used his credit card to get a taxi to the airport, used his credit card at, let's say, DIA, then he used his credit card 14 hours, 15 hours later in Tokyo and Narita, then he used his credit card again in Ho Chi Minh. Let's say 4 or 5 hours later. You'd stitch the hours together, a complex event system would be able to see that and say, the most likely outcome is Charles has traveled. Okay, so the question was, should Cardano support this behavior natively? And my belief is no. And the reason being is I think this is actually an example of a very profitable and good dApp for people to build that acts as a service provider to Cardano. So you'll have Marlowe contracts that require oracles or require feedback for them to be particularly useful for things that are connected to real-life events. And there are going to be people who offer services to those contracts. It is really sensible to abstract away those services to trusted servers or to a dApp or to even another layer, a control layer in the system that provides all of these things, and it's built in a particular way so a person can pay a fee for the reduction in reliance or trust on a particular entity or individual. There's also a notion of complex event systems being bespoke to a domain or being designed as a black box, meaning that the code needs to be proprietary. So there are protocols that people are considering, like doing data analytics, for example, using order-preserving encryption or homomorphic encryption with some degree of acceleration. And in those cases, you can keep the trading algorithms or the event processing algorithms secret, but it's an open and very complicated topic, and it's one that people think a lot about. There are projects like Endor, for example, that are trying to tackle that have some pretty interesting and fascinating people. But if you're real passionate about it, I think it actually would be a great business to operate. And it'd be really cool to see how that works with Marlowe and how that can actually make the financial space better. And my personal belief is it would be a cool control layer. It'd be a really cool system to augment Cardano. And it's something that domain experts can deploy. That's a good question. Joe Rogan podcast from Tom Cost. Love Joe Rogan, love the intellectual dark web. I listen to Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, and others in that group regularly, both on the left and the right. It's really amazing to me that some of the smartest people who are given the freedom to engage and interact on a multi-hour format and actually have a direct relationship with the consumers of the media, so it's almost as if it's a conversation as opposed to a broadcast, are also people who tend to be completely ignored by the mainstream media. Joe Rogan probably has as many aggregate listeners and as much impact as Bill O'Reilly ever did or Anderson Cooper ever did, yet for some reason the media considers him to be an entertainer or a comedian. The man is not. The man is a guy with a huge following who talks about really interesting things, from lifestyle things like life extension and ketogenic diets to alternative diets like the carnivore diet or consequences of veganism, to other really interesting things like what is it like to be a CEO of a major company, to sit down with a guy like Elon Musk for more than 15 minutes and really have a deep personal open-ended conversation with him, or to talk to a guy like Jordan Peterson and try to understand what his experiences have been like as he's been brutalized by a very strange faction of identity politics people, is tremendously valuable to society, because these stories cannot and will not be told on television. So I have a lot of respect for Joe. I have a lot of respect for Jordan and others. Sometimes agree with them, sometimes disagree with them, but I love the format. And I think the format is insanely productive and effective. And it's also becoming the format that people under the age of 40 are consuming. There was a recent survey of truck drivers and night warehouse operators and other people who have a lot of downtime, a lot of sitting, or a lot of sedentary work, where they're maybe operating forklift and no one talks to them for hours on end. And a lot of these people, more than 30–40% of them, consume podcasts. And they listen to things like Joe Rogan. So it's not just the erudite who has the PhD sitting with the luxury in his padded office, the glass of sherry, saying, oh, now let me be stimulated by the intellectual dark web. This is truly cutting across all economic zones and lines. So the succinct short answer is, yes, I would love to be on the Joe Rogan podcast. It'd be a heck of a lot of fun to meet him, talk to him, spend some time with him. It'd be fun to talk to Tim Ferriss. It'd be fun to talk to Sam Harris. I think we do a lot of good there. Now, in terms of the greatest bang for our buck, I think it would be probably more productive for me to be on that show once we have smart contracts and Shelley out the door, because in addition to going on and being aspirational and telling the world about all the cool things we could do in the future, I'd be able to say, download the software, look at the tutorials, and today, right here, right now, you can be building the future. So you have to be pretty smart about when you go to large venues, because people's attention span, unfortunately, is not what it used to be. And we'll try that. What happens after Cardano 1.4 from Papadopoulos? Well, Papa, Cardano 1.4. So 1.4 is the first time we're actually rolling out code that IOHK built from formal specifications. So that's a big milestone for us. And boy, we're super excited about it. And the dev cutoff, I believe, has just happened today or tomorrow. We had to get a few extra things in it. QA process has begun. And we're working like bats out of hell to try to accelerate that a little bit, because I really would love to get it out soon. So the next step is to Ouroboros BFT. The paper for that will be published at the end of the month. And that's a halfway house protocol between what we need right now. Sarah Kell didn't fully implement Ouroboros the way it needed to be implemented to make it easy to move from Ouroboros to Genesis. So we have to fill that in. And Ouroboros BFT is a really simple, easy way to do that for us. So we have a plan. We've already implemented it as a prototype, and we've done simulations on it. We have a great degree of understanding of how that protocol works. In fact, we have 5 implementation efforts, some on the Scala side, some on the prototyping side, some on the Haskell side, that are all independently looking at this. So one aspect of the post 1.4 work will be Ouroboros BFT as a halfway house transition for us to get to Shelley. Another dimension of that work will be decoupling the wallet backend, which is currently connected to the Cardano client, to pull it off as an independent standalone product. The advantage of that is we could take the Haskell wallet backend that's built on verified formal code, really, really good Haskell code, and connect it to the Rust client. And then the Rust client could have V1 API compatibility, or you could actually take that with some modification and potentially even connect it to a Bitcoin wallet or a Monero wallet or whatever that has a UTXO accounting system that's parameterizable. And also, it means that the wallet backend can then have an independent release cycle to everything else. So we can do what we've done with the Rust client with building manual transactions and offline transactions and extending that API for other parameters like delegation and so forth. We can do that without being on the normal release cycle for Cardano. So those are going to be near-term goals that we're working towards. In the meantime, we have 3 parallel teams working full-time on all of the Shelley-related stuff, some on delegation, some on Ouroboros Genesis and other dimensions of that stuff, and some on the new ledger rules, some on how we're going to extend the UTXO set to include Plutus and Marlowe. It's a humongous amount of work. Duncan is going to be preparing some content, some videos, and our product marketers are going to be kind of parsing down all of this stuff and trying to put it into an understandable roadmap for people, so people can get a pretty good sense of the scope and scale of Shelley. Shelley, what we thought was going to be this year, massively larger, and that's why it's taken so much more time for us to very carefully think about it. It's larger in that the interdependencies and the way that the software works, you have to think super carefully about it. It's not going to be necessarily a billion lines of code. It's more just these things have to be very carefully and rigorously thought about so that when we do deploy those protocols, they work really well together and we don't run into the same situation we ran into in September of 2017 with the initial launch of Cardano. The good news is people are working a lot faster now, and we cut our QA time in half, and the release cycles will only get faster. Processes are definitely getting better. Working with some good people on that, like Jean-Christophe and Ben Ford, and we've already seen noticeable differences in software quality and strategy. So Duncan at Sco Van Ries and Phil Kant really doing great work. The squad leaders like Matthias and Vincent and others doing great work as well. Vincent on Rust Cardano is just extraordinary to see his progress that he's making, and we look forward to rolling things out there as quickly as we can. So we have Plan A, a Plan B. The next versions will be on Ouroboros BFT and decoupling of components in preparation for Shelley, and then Shelley testnet next, and then after that it's basically Shelley decentralization. Then very shortly thereafter, tackle on some sidechains, extended UTXO, and Plutus, Marlowe, and then KVM and Yellow. So a lot of stuff is coming soon, and long overdue. Are you still convinced ADA market cap will reach $1 trillion? I said I'd like ADA to be the first cryptocurrency that reaches $1 trillion market cap, because my point behind that wasn't that it was at $1 trillion. My point was that it achieved the goal of being a financial operating system. The only way that you can ever get to a cap that high is to be useful to the world and have hundreds of thousands to millions to hundreds of millions of people doing things on a daily or near daily basis on your system, from loans to insurance. My goal is to get it there because the world needs it. So I do believe we will get there. Let's take another one from the threads. Does Jeremy Wood run undercover operations of Cardano? We barely hear about him, which might be the only excuse I might think of considering his intelligence and co-founder position. Jeremy is an interesting guy. Jeremy and I, we've been working together for like 5 years now, and he's always the devil's advocate for everything I do, and he's Mr. Checks and Balances. Jeremy takes a more private role, and I'm the guy who always ends up getting pushed out into the public domain. And he got married and had kids, and he's working hard though. Jeremy is coming with me to Thailand, and he's going to have some fun there with me, and we're going to probably do some presentations. He tends to take care of things that, if they don't get done properly, would kill the company. Existential problems that require very delicate, incredibly focused work, and it can't really be delegated or entrusted to a manager or to an employee. It's just too much responsibility. And there's been several things in the history of our company that have required that level of focus and detail. So that's what he tends to do. It's really the unsung role and the unsung job in the organization, because it's thankless and silent. And if you succeed, well, the organization keeps on living. But if you fail, the organization goes out of business. So there's no upside, but there's only downside. And that's really something only a co-founder of a company can do. So that's been his historical role. He's also started doing more work on the product management side and building out product management for the company. But to be frank, our IOHK wouldn't exist without Jeremy, and Cardano wouldn't exist without him. So he's as meaningful and important company as I am to the company, if not more so in some certain circumstances. And I'm very lucky to have him as a co-founder. So this is an interesting question. Has IOHK worked with DARPA? The direct answer is no. But when you do cryptographic research, PL research, or any of these things, it's very common to see that funding for papers that you're jointly funding also comes from either the NSF or DARPA. Most recently, Pramod, who is a researcher out in University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, published a series of 3 papers, Polyshard, and paper on incentives, and a paper called Spider, which was based on payment channels. Now, all of these papers received funding for IOHK, but Pramod also got funding from the NSF and DARPA. So occasionally you will see IOHK-related projects getting joint funding from other agencies. Now, these projects are out in the open domain. These projects do not have intellectual property associated with them. It's open source, and these projects are published basically and viewable to the funders at the same time as they are to the general public. So there is no secrecy or bias there. Our organization does not do clearance work. I don't have to go to a SCIF, don't have to file a SF-86 or anything like that. And I intend on not doing clearance work at the moment. It's just too much hassle. We're also a global company. We operate in 16 countries, and we try to be politically neutral as we can be. That said, DARPA is a great funder of high-risk, high-return projects, and they are responsible for the creation of many interesting things, from the internet itself, through the development of TCP/IP, Vinsurf and Bob Kahn, to Siri through the Kalo project, Cognitive Assistant Learns and Organizes, that was run from 2003 to 2008 by SRI International and a large cadre of scientists. And there's probably a strong appetite at DARPA for a PL and blockchain and smart contract play that could be as equally meaningful as Kalo. So if that occurs, there's no doubt that we would probably be involved in some capacity, because simply we have so many researchers, some of which have already worked at that organization, but it wouldn't be exclusively to us. And we have no intention of participating at the moment on anything in the clearance side. Charles, any plans to visit India? Yes, I will come to India in 2019. Okay, let's take another one from the Reddit, because people took the time to throw all these questions in. Has IOHK given any time or research into implementing a stablecoin? We certainly have, and we really haven't gotten to the point where we're able to say anything public yet, but we've talked to a lot of people. We're attending a stablecoin conference pretty soon. We like what the Saga guys are doing. but it's something I'll punt on. But know that we are interested in it because it does need to exist in our system for us to be successful with lending and insurance and commerce. I heard you mention at one point when Cardano is 100% complete, you could basically attach EOS to the computation layer and they could take advantage of the Cardano blockchain. Well, sure, we could fork EOS and attach it to our chain. I don't think it's a particularly good idea for people to lose money in that Rube Goldberg machine, but if they want to do it, someone could do it. By the way, there's another great paper for people to read. Recently came out called Mad Max. So if you Google Mad Max Ethereum gas pricing, something like that, you'll see a paper that was submitted to Popol in the excuse me. It's a PL conference, and it talks about where everything can go wrong with the Ethereum gas model. So gas economics is an interesting topic. All right, let's see what else we got here. And yes, I will go to Australia as well. We have several Australian employees. Bruno Paleo, the head of our enterprise group, is there. Eric DeCastro, the head of Cardano Core, is there. And we have a lot of friends out in Australia and some friends in New Zealand as well. So it'd be nice to go out there. Trying to. Will Tone Vase still say Cardano is a scam after Shelley? The answer is yes. But Tone's been telling me that to my face for a long time. I guess he's no longer asking me to go to jail. He just says I should be banned from coding and from running a company. But I actually like Tone a lot. I see him from time to time in person, and we once smoked cigars together in Odessa, Ukraine. That was an interesting story. Is IOHK considering extending its contract with building Cardano beyond guaranteed funding through 2020? The answer is if the Treasury system exists, we will submit a ballot asking for additional funding, and the community will get to decide that. If we are to decentralize, there cannot be a cult of personality. There cannot be custodial companies. We can't have, even if you like the guy, somebody in power forever. It's the whole point of creating things like term limits. It's the whole point of creating things like checks and balances. It's the whole point of creating diversity. Whenever you create something good, people fork it, people steal it. Like, no one really cared about Ethereum until Ethereum was successful. Then everybody wanted to be Ethereum, and a lot of people forked Ethereum and stole the code and said, hey, look, we're a better Ethereum. Similarly, no one particularly cares about our proof of stake algorithm or other these things because, you know, it hasn't been fully deployed yet. But when it is, a lot of people are going to fork it. A lot of people are going to have a difference of opinion. And actually, some of those people might be a heck of a lot smarter than us and a heck of a lot more qualified than us to actually take the system to the next generation. Visionary leaders all have shelf lives. It happened to HP, it's happening to Apple, it happened to IBM, it happened to Microsoft, and we're no different. So for a time, we will be productive and capable of handling things the way they need to be handled. But it is super important for the ecosystem to make sure that there is diversity in thought, in execution. So the first step there is to develop the Cardano improvement proposal process and to get all of the designs of the protocol into formal implementation independent specifications. Then we have a common reference of where are we at and where we'd like to go. Then the Treasury system comes in and allows us to vote on funding of priorities, marketing priorities, development priorities, entrepreneurial priorities. And embedded in there is this implicit notion of who should be the custodian to take us to the next place, or custodians, and there should be sufficient funding for multiple ones. IOHK will make the argument, as we do to governments for grant funding like the European Union or NSF or others, that we ought to have a position in that collective of people who are contributing. But it ought not to be exclusive or the sole position. It's merely one of many. And if we can't provide value, like the foundation's not providing value at the moment, in my opinion, then you ought to be able to get rid of me. And if you can't, then that's a dictatorship. If you can, that's a democracy. I like living in the latter, not the former. Why no ledger? What went wrong? Pretty simple. Another one of the foundation things. Although there were some issues with Cardano itself that made it difficult to roll out ledger support. We use a different elliptic curve, ED25519. We also used the way the software was written made ledger interoperability a bit difficult. We've gotten to the point where it's a firmware update, and I think the first thing that's going to support ledger is going to be the Icarus platform, so Yoroi and potentially Infinito. And then eventually it'll work its way backward into Daedalus after we've decoupled the wallet, upgraded the wallet a little bit to support Icarus-style addresses. When Ledger, very soon, thanks to Yoroi being out and thanks to Ledger having a firmware update available. Will we get it before the end of the year? It's hard to say because it's not completely in our wheelhouse. Okay, last question. Come on, let's make it a good one. We got some crazy people in this forum, man. All right. Saren, like Moshe, he's a good guy. I went to his office in Israel. He has this beautiful picture of Steve Jobs on the wall, and he collects a lot of interesting memorabilia, and it's a pretty entrepreneurial place. It pinged me over Facebook and mentioned that the launch is coming soon. So I'll call him, talk to him, ask him what's going on. Their engineers have talked to our engineers, and they've definitely looked at, excuse me, integrating the Rust code. But it's still an interesting open question of when and how that support's going to roll out. Finny looks like a really compelling, interesting device. Last time I was in Japan, I actually ran into some of those guys, and they showed me the prototype, and it's a phone, and the back of it slides up like this, and you have the hardware wallet up here, and it's actually an independent device from the phone. So it's kind of like having a ledger built into your system. So it's really cool. When I hear more, we might do some sort of joint announcement. At the very least, I'll let you guys know when I've had a chance to talk to them. But I just haven't had a discussion with the Siren guys since I was in Japan. And at the moment, they were preparing for launch of their phone. And I know their engineers are talking to our engineers, mostly asking questions about APIs and the Rust code. Okay. Thank you guys so much. It's almost 2 hours now. Let's see here. Did I smoke any weed? Guys, I live in Colorado. Weed's been legal there for 10 years. And it's not called the Mile High State for nothing. Canada legalized it, but they're way behind the curve, man. Way behind. It's like adopting disco in the 80s. It's too late. Go home. All right. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate your time, and I hope this AMA was useful. Cheers.